The summer I turned 23, I took a job with Harlan Timber out of desperation more than ambition. The economy had gutted most opportunities in our corner of Kentucky, and surveying land paid better than anything else a young man without connections could hope to find. The work was solitary, which suited me fine. I'd spend weeks at a time walking property lines, marking trees, cataloging terrain for the company's expansion plans. It was honest work, if lonely, and I'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of it by the time they handed me the survey map for the Brennan Tract. My grandfather was still alive then, though barely. Lung cancer had whittled him down to bone and memory, and most days he drifted between sleep and a kind of waking dream, where the past felt more real than the present. But when I mentioned Brennan's Hollow at Sunday dinner, his eyes snapped into focus with a clarity I hadn't seen in months. He grabbed my wrist with a strength that surprised me, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. "You stay out of that hollow, boy," he said. "That's cursed ground. Has been since before my grandfather's time." My mother tried to calm him, assuming it was the morphine talking, but I knew better. I'd seen my grandfather face down black bears, pull men from mine collapses, bury two of his own children before they reached adulthood. Fear was not something he wore easily, and in that moment, I saw it carved deep into the lines of his face. He told me the stories then, the ones the old-timers used to whisper about when they thought children weren't listening. How nothing would grow in that hollow except twisted, stunted trees that reached toward the sky like supplicants begging for mercy. How hunters who wandered in would come out changed, if they came out at all. How there'd been a settlement there once, back before the Civil War, and how every soul in it had vanished over the course of a single winter. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty cabins and hearths gone cold. I nodded along and promised him I'd be careful, but in my heart, I'd already dismissed it. Mountain superstition, I told myself. Every holler and ridge in Appalachia had its ghost stories, its warnings about places where the devil walked or the old ones still held sway. I was young and educated and foolish enough to believe that daylight and modern maps could protect me from anything the forest might hold. The morning I set out for Brennan's Hollow, the sky was that pale, washed-out blue you only see in late August, when the summer heat has baked all the color from the world. I parked my truck at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades, the ruts so deep I worried about the axles. From there, it was a 4-mile hike through dense hardwood forest before I'd reached the property line. The walk started out pleasant enough. Birdsong filtered through the canopy, and a light breeze carried the smell of pine and decay that I'd come to associate with the deep woods. I made good time, marking my progress on the topographic map and flagging trees for future reference. By late morning, I could see the terrain beginning to change, the ground sloping downward into a natural depression that matched the hollow's outline on my survey charts. I stopped at the tree line and felt something cold settle in my chest. The forest had gone silent, not quiet, the way it gets when a predator passes through, but silent in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the ringing in my ears that comes when there's no sound to fill the space, and I thought about turning back. I thought about telling my supervisor that the terrain was impassable, that the hollow would need aerial surveying, that someone else could handle this particular stretch of wilderness. But I was young, and I was proud, and I'd already made promises to myself about the kind of man I wanted to be. I stepped past the tree line and descended into Brennan's Hollow. My grandfather had been right about the trees. They grew wrong down there, their trunks corkscrewed and bent at angles that defied the logic of light-seeking growth. Some of them had bark that looked almost like skin, stretched and pale and marked with patterns that might have been natural grain or might have been something else entirely. The ground beneath my feet was covered in dead leaves, but nothing else. No ferns, no mushrooms, no moss on the rocks. Just that thick carpet of brown and gray, crunching beneath my boots like old bones. I found the cabin around midday, though I'd lost track of the exact time. My watch had stopped working somewhere on the descent, the hands frozen at 11:47, and the light filtering through the canopy seemed wrong, dimmer than it should have been for early afternoon. The structure was old, far older than any building had a right to be in country that had only been settled for 200 years. The walls were made of hand-hewn logs, many of them rotted through, and the roof had collapsed on one side, leaving the interior open to the sky. But there was smoke rising from the chimney, thin and gray and curling upward through the still air like a question mark. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had, every lesson my grandfather had drilled into me about survival and caution, and knowing when to leave well enough alone, screamed at me to turn around. But I was a surveyor. Documenting structures was part of the job. And some part of me, some foolish, curious part that I've spent years trying to silence, needed to know who was living in a place that shouldn't have been habitable. I approached the cabin slowly, calling out a greeting that the silence swallowed before it could travel more than a few feet. The front door was gone, just an empty frame hung with shadows, and through it I could see the dim outline of a room, a fireplace, a table, something that might have been a chair. Someone was standing at the window. I saw them only in pieces at first. A shape, a stillness, the suggestion of a face pressed close to glass that was too dirty to be transparent. They were watching me. I felt the weight of their attention, like a physical pressure, pushing against my chest, making it hard to draw breath. And their eyes, God help me, their eyes caught no light. They were just dark spots in a pale blur, fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach turn to water. I don't remember deciding to leave. One moment I was standing there, frozen in place, and the next I was walking back toward the tree line with my survey half finished and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I didn't run. Some animal part of my brain warned me that running would invite pursuit, that showing fear to whatever lived in that cabin would be the last mistake I ever made. So I walked, steady and measured and deliberate, even as every nerve in my body begged me to sprint. I made it out of the hollow before dark. That much I know for certain, because I remember the way the light changed when I crested the ridge, the way color seemed to bleed back into the world like water soaking into dry cloth. The birdsong returned, the wind picked up, and somewhere behind me, in the depths of that cursed ground, I heard something that might have been a voice calling out a name I couldn't quite understand. I drove straight to my motel, a rundown place off the highway, where the logging company had booked rooms for the survey team. My hands shook so badly I could barely fit the key in the lock, and once I was inside, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until my heartbeat finally slowed to something approaching normal. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself it had been a squatter, some homeless soul who'd found shelter in an abandoned cabin, nothing more sinister than poverty and isolation. I almost believed it. Then I stepped outside to grab my survey bag from the truck and saw the footprints. They started at my rear bumper and led in a straight line to my motel room door. Small prints, child-sized, pressed deep into the dried mud of the parking lot. Whoever had made them had been barefoot, their toes splayed wide and their heels digging in with each step like they were walking on unfamiliar ground. The prints stopped at my threshold, not beside the door, not veering off toward another room, right at my doorstep, as if whoever had made them had stood there waiting, deciding, considering whether to knock or simply come inside. There were no prints leading away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window with my survey knife in my hand and watched the parking lot until dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. Nothing moved, nothing came. But I knew, with a certainty that I've never been able to shake, that something had followed me out of Brennan's Hollow. Something had tracked me to my door and stood there in the darkness, breathing, waiting, wanting something I couldn't name. I quit the logging company the next morning, drove to the office, turned in my equipment, and told them the Brennan tract was impassable. They didn't argue. I found out later that 3 other surveyors had made the same assessment over the years, each of them citing different reasons, none of them willing to go into detail. The company tried to sell the land but couldn't find a buyer. They tried to partner with the state for conservation, but the paperwork kept getting lost or misfiled or returned with errors that no one could explain. Eventually, Harlan Timber went bankrupt, their assets scattered to creditors who never did anything with that particular parcel. The hollow remains, unsurveyed, unlogged, untouched. My grandfather died 3 weeks after I left that job, passing quietly in his sleep on a night when the first autumn chill crept down from the high peaks. At his funeral, an old man I didn't recognize approached me and asked if I'd been the one surveying the Brennan tract. When I nodded, he just shook his head and looked at me with something between pity and fear. "They let you leave," he said. "Most folks aren't that lucky." He walked away before I could ask what he meant, and I never saw him again. That was 15 years ago. I've built a life since then, moved away from the mountains, found work in a city where the streets are paved, and the forests are manicured parks with walking trails and informational plaques. I've done my best to forget about that summer, about the hollow and the cabin, and the eyes that watched me from a window that should have been dark. But some nights, when the air is still and the darkness presses close, I wake from dreams I can't remember with the taste of dead leaves on my tongue and the smell of old smoke in my nostrils. And sometimes, standing at my own window in the quiet hours before dawn, I could swear I see a figure standing in the shadows across the street. Small, still, waiting, child-sized, barefoot, with eyes that catch no light, waiting for permission to come inside. I have spent most of my adult life photographing things that people have chosen to forget. Abandoned factories in the Rust Belt, shuttered schoolhouses in dying coal towns, the skeletal remains of family farms that couldn't survive another generation. There's a particular kind of beauty in decay, a honesty that you don't find in places where people still live and work and pretend that everything is fine. The camera doesn't lie, and neither do empty buildings. They tell you exactly what happened, even when no one else will. The church found me on a Thursday in late October, though I suppose it would be more accurate to say that I found it. I was driving through a stretch of eastern Kentucky that my map insisted was populated, but my eyes told me otherwise. Mile after mile of empty hollers and overgrown fields, the occasional mobile home with a satellite dish pointed toward a sky the color of old dishwater. I had been shooting for 3 days straight, sleeping in my car, living on gas station coffee and the kind of sandwiches that come wrapped in plastic and taste like nothing at all. I was tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, and I was thinking about turning back when I saw the steeple. It rose above the tree line, like a crooked finger pointing toward heaven, listing to the left at an angle that suggested decades of neglect. The white paint had long since surrendered to the elements, leaving behind a patchwork of gray wood and darker stains that might have been water damage or might have been something else. A dirt road branched off from the highway, rutted and overgrown but still passable, and I followed it without really deciding to. That's how it works sometimes. You don't choose the photograph chooses you. The church sat at the end of the road in a clearing that felt smaller than it should have, the trees pressing close on all sides like curious neighbors. It was a simple structure, the kind of white clapboard country church that you see in postcards and paintings, all clean lines and Protestant modesty. Except nothing about this place felt clean. The windows were intact but so covered in grime that they looked almost opaque, like cataracts on an old man's eyes. The front steps had rotted through in places, and the door hung slightly open, as if the building itself was exhaling. I sat in my car for a long time before I got out. I told myself I was checking my equipment, making sure my batteries were charged and my memory cards were empty. But the truth is that something about that church made me hesitant in a way I couldn't explain. I had photographed hundreds of abandoned buildings by then. I had crawled through collapsed factories and descended into flooded basements, and once spent 3 hours in a condemned hospital where the ceiling tiles fell like snow around me. I was not easily spooked, but sitting there in my car, watching that crooked steeple lean against the gray sky, I felt the first cold fingers of something that might have been dread. I got out anyway. That's the job. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and the smell hit me immediately. Not decay, exactly, though there was something organic underneath it, more like old paper and candle wax, and the particular mustiness of spaces that haven't felt fresh air in decades. The sanctuary was small, maybe 30 pews in total, arranged in neat rows that led toward a simple wooden pulpit. Hymnals sat in the holders on the back of each pew, their pages yellowed and swollen with moisture but otherwise undisturbed. A layer of dust covered everything, thick enough that my footprints left clear impressions in it, and in that dust I could see that no one had walked these aisles in a very long time. I took photographs for nearly an hour, documenting everything from the water stains on the ceiling to the names carved into the pew backs by generations of bored children. The light was terrible, that flat gray afternoon light that makes everything look slightly dead, but I worked with what I had. It was only when I approached the pulpit that I noticed the trapdoor. It was set into the floor behind the raised platform where the preacher would have stood, partially hidden by a threadbare rug that had been pushed aside at some point in the past. 2 iron rings were set into the wood, tarnished but solid, and the door itself was made of planks that looked older than the church around them. I knelt down and brushed away the dust, looking for hinges or a lock, some indication of what lay beneath. There was nothing, just old wood and old iron, and that persistent smell of something organic that seemed stronger here, closer to the source. I should have left. I knew that then, and I know it now. Every instinct I had, every lesson learned from years of exploring places where accidents happen and help is far away, told me to photograph the trapdoor and move on. But there was something about those iron rings, something about the way they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, that made me reach down and grip them and pull. The door came up easier than I expected, counterweighted somehow, and beneath it was a darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I shone the beam down into the opening and saw only the first few rungs of a wooden ladder descending into nothing. The darkness below seemed to drink the light, swallowing it before it could illuminate whatever waited at the bottom. I could hear something though, a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, rising up from the depths like air escaping from a tomb. I climbed down. The ladder was longer than it should have been. I counted the rungs as I descended, a habit from years of exploring unstable structures, and I had reached 37 before my feet touched solid ground. 37 rungs, each about a foot apart. I was standing nearly 40 feet below a church whose foundation couldn't have been more than a few feet deep. The mathematics didn't work. Nothing about this place worked. I swept my flashlight around and realized I was standing in a cavern. Not a basement, not a cellar, but a natural cave of limestone and ancient rock that stretched back into darkness further than my light could reach. The ceiling arched high above me, dripping with moisture, and the floor was worn smooth in places, as if by the passage of countless feet over countless years. The church above me felt suddenly very far away, separated by more than just distance. It was the walls that made me stop breathing. Every surface, every inch of stone that I could see, was covered in names. They were scratched into the rock with varying degrees of skill and depth, some carved with what looked like professional tools, and others gouged out with fingernails or the edges of broken stones. They overlapped in places, newer names written over older ones, creating a palimpsest of identity that stretched back further than I could comprehend. Some of the names were familiar, common Appalachian surnames that I recognized from county histories and cemetery records. Others were in languages I didn't know, scripts I couldn't read, symbols that might have been letters or might have been something else entirely. I walked forward in a daze, my flashlight sweeping across the walls, trying to take it all in. There were thousands of names, tens of thousands, more than could possibly fit in a space this size, and yet they were there, covering every surface, filling every crevice, climbing up toward the ceiling and disappearing into shadows my light couldn't reach. Some of them still showed pale dust beneath the carved letters, fresh enough that they might have been made yesterday. Others were so worn by time and moisture that they were barely legible, just suggestions of identity preserved in stone. I found my grandmother's name near the entrance to the cavern, carved into a smooth section of limestone about waist height, Margaret Ellen Hoskins, 1919 to 1987. I knew those dates by heart. I had stood at her grave in Lexington and traced them on her headstone with my fingers. She had lived and died 40 miles from this place, in a city where she had spent her entire adult life, and she had never once mentioned this church, or this cavern, or any of the things I was seeing. I was certain of that. My grandmother had been a practical woman, a retired school teacher who believed in science and reason and the fundamental explicability of the world. She would not have kept a secret like this. And yet there was her name, carved into stone in a cave beneath an abandoned church, surrounded by thousands of others. I don't remember climbing out of that cavern. My next clear memory is of sitting in my car as the sun set behind the trees, my hands shaking so badly that I couldn't fit the key into the ignition. The photographs I had taken showed nothing but blur and shadow, every image corrupted by something my camera couldn't process. I drove back to the highway in darkness and didn't stop until I reached a motel 3 counties away, where I sat in the bathtub fully clothed and let hot water run over me until it turned cold. I never told anyone what I found. How could I? What words would I use to describe a cavern full of names, a church that held more below it than above, a grandmother's identity carved into stone 40 miles from where she was buried? I finished my book without including any photographs from that trip, and I never drove through that part of Kentucky again. I told myself that I would forget about it in time, that the memory would fade the way all memories do, worn smooth by the passage of years, until it felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened. Last month, I received a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into my mailbox along with bills and junk mail and a catalog from a camping supply company I had never ordered from. The envelope was plain white, the kind you can buy at any office supply store, with my name and address printed in neat block letters that looked almost mechanical. There was no return address. The postmark was smudged beyond recognition. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the cavern wall, lit from below by a light source I couldn't identify. The image quality was poor, grainy, and slightly out of focus, but I could make out the names carved into the stone with perfect clarity. My grandmother's name was there, just as I remembered it. Margaret Ellen Hoskins, 1919 to 1987. And beside it, carved in letters that looked fresh enough to still show pale dust beneath them, was another name. My name. I have not slept properly since that letter arrived. I lie awake in the darkness and listen to my house settle around me, every creak and groan taking on a significance that I cannot ignore. I have researched the church, searching county records and historical archives for any mention of it, and found nothing. According to every map and database I can access, that stretch of dirt road leads nowhere. The church does not exist. The cavern does not exist. The names do not exist. And yet I have the photograph. I have the memory of my grandmother's name carved into limestone, surrounded by thousands of others. I have the knowledge that someone, somewhere, descended into that darkness and added my name to the wall. I do not know what it means. I do not know if it is a warning or a prophecy or simply a statement of fact, a record of something that has not yet come to pass. I do not know who sent the letter or how they found me or what they expect me to do with this information. I only know that my name is carved in stone 40 feet below an abandoned church, waiting for something I cannot imagine. I have thought about going back. The idea surfaces late at night when my defenses are down, a whisper in the darkness, suggesting that I need to see it for myself, need to confirm what the photograph shows, need to understand what it means to have my name carved into that ancient wall. Some nights, the pull is so strong that I find myself standing at my front door, car keys in hand, ready to drive through the night to a place that does not exist on any map. But I never go. Something holds me back, some instinct deeper than reason or curiosity, and I think perhaps it is the memory of my grandmother. She knew about that place. She had been there, had carved her name or had it carved for her, and she had never spoken of it. She had lived her life in silence, keeping that secret until the day she died and beyond. There must have been a reason. I have started paying attention to the obituaries now. Every morning, I scan the names of the recently deceased, looking for surnames I recognize from that cavern wall. I don't know what I'm searching for. Proof, perhaps. Confirmation that those names belong to real people who lived and died in these mountains, that the cavern is a record of something rather than a prophecy of what is to come. Or maybe I'm looking for my own name, waiting for the day when it appears in newsprint instead of stone. The photograph sits in my desk drawer, face down. I haven't looked at it since the day it arrived. But some nights, when the darkness presses close and sleep refuses to come, I can feel it there, waiting, passant, certain of something that I am only beginning to understand. My grandmother took her silence to the grave. I wonder now if I will do the same. The cabin on Sawyer Ridge was the only place in the world where my father ever seemed truly at peace. He was a hard man in most respects, a coal company accountant who spent his days buried in spreadsheets and his evenings nursing whiskey in silence. But something happened to him when we turned off the paved road and started the long climb up the mountain. The tension would drain from his shoulders, the lines around his eyes would soften, and by the time we pulled into the gravel clearing in front of the cabin, he was almost someone I didn't recognize. Someone who laughed, someone who told stories, someone who would sit on the porch with me after dinner and point out constellations until the mosquitoes drove us inside. My grandfather had built that cabin in 1952, the year he came home from Korea with a shattered knee and a need for solitude that never quite left him. He chose the spot because it was remote, nearly 2 hours from the nearest town on roads that turned to mud every spring and ice every winter. The cabin itself was simple, just 2 bedrooms and a main room with a stone fireplace, but it sat on 40 acres of old-growth forest that climbed up toward the ridge behind it. Those woods were my kingdom during the summers of my childhood. I knew every trail, every swimming hole, every clearing where the deer came to graze at dawn. I thought I knew everything there was to know about that mountain. I was 12 the summer I learned how wrong I was. It started in late June, 3 weeks into what should have been another perfect summer. My mother had stayed home that year to care for her sister, who was recovering from surgery, so it was just my father and me in the cabin. I didn't mind. My father was better one-on-one, more present somehow, and we fell into an easy rhythm of fishing in the mornings and hiking in the afternoons and reading by lantern light after the sun went down. The days were hot, but the nights were cool, and I remember thinking that this might be the best summer we'd ever had. The first time I saw her was on a Tuesday evening. I know it was Tuesday because my father always made his famous chili on Tuesdays, a tradition that stretched back to my grandfather's time. I was sitting on the back porch, waiting for dinner and watching the light fade from the sky, when I noticed movement on the ridge trail. The ridge trail was an old path that ran along the spine of the mountain, connecting our property to a ranger station about 5 miles north. Hikers used it sometimes, though not often, and I was used to seeing the occasional backpacker pass by in the distance. But something about this figure was different. It was a woman, dressed in white, and she was moving in a way that I couldn't quite process. Not walking, exactly. More like gliding, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground, covering distance at a pace that didn't match her unhurried movements. It was like watching a film where someone had sped up the footage without changing the frame rate. I called out to my father, but by the time he came to the porch, she was gone, disappeared around a bend in the trail, or swallowed by the trees. He told me it was probably just a hiker, maybe someone doing a twilight trek to the ranger station. Nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him, but I had seen the way she moved, and I knew that no hiker in the world walked like that. She came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Always at dusk, when the light was failing and the shadows were stretching long across the mountainside. Always walking the same section of trail, the stretch that ran directly behind our property. Always moving with that strange, gliding gait that seemed to defy the physics of human locomotion. I started watching for her, positioning myself on the back porch as soon as the sun began to drop, waiting for that flash of white among the trees. My father thought I was becoming obsessed, and maybe I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about her, something fundamentally off that my 12-year-old brain couldn't quite articulate. On the 7th night, she stopped. I was watching from my usual spot when I saw her appear on the trail, that familiar figure in white gliding through the gathering darkness. But instead of continuing past our property, she paused, just stopped, mid-stride, and stood perfectly still. She was facing the trail, her back to me, and for a long moment I thought maybe she had heard something, maybe she was listening for a sound in the forest. Then, slowly, she turned. She turned to look at our cabin, at me. Even from that distance, even in the fading light, I could see that something was wrong with her face. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, and when I did, my blood went cold in a way I had never experienced before. Her face was blank, not shadowed, not obscured by distance or darkness. Blank, smooth skin where her eyes should have been, smooth skin where her mouth should have been. A face like a mannequin, featureless and wrong, turned toward me with an attention I could feel, even though she had nothing to see with. I screamed. I screamed loud enough that my father came running from inside, his face white with fear, certain that I had been hurt. But by the time he reached the porch, she was gone. The trail was empty. The woods were silent. And when I tried to explain what I had seen, the words came out jumbled and hysterical, impossible to believe. My father searched the trail the next morning. He found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had walked that path in days. He came back to the cabin with a look on his face that I had never seen before, a mixture of concern and something else. Something that might have been the first stirrings of his own doubt. She came back that night, and the next, and the next. For 3 weeks, she walked that trail every evening, and every night she stopped at the same spot and stood there, motionless, facing our cabin with her featureless face. Sometimes she stayed for hours, a white shape frozen against the darkening mountainside. Sometimes she was gone in minutes. There was no pattern I could discern, no logic to her appearances. She simply was, as inevitable as the sunset, as inexplicable as the wind. My father tried to rationalize it at first. A hiker with a skin condition, a woman wearing a mask. some kind of optical illusion caused by the distance and the failing light. But even he couldn't explain how she stood so still for so long, how she appeared at the same time every night, how she seemed to know exactly where to stop to be visible from our back porch. By the end of the second week, he had stopped making excuses. By the end of the third, he had stopped going outside after dark. We left the cabin 2 days early that summer. My father said it was because of work, some emergency at the office that required his attention, but I knew the truth. He was afraid. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes, and it terrified me more than anything on that ridge. I never went back. My parents sold the cabin when I was in college. My mother had been pressing for it for years, complaining about the upkeep and the distance and the cost of maintaining a property we rarely used. My father resisted at first, but eventually he gave in. I think part of him was relieved. I think part of him had been looking for an excuse to let go of the place, to sever the connection to whatever we had seen on that ridge. The new owners were a young couple from Cincinnati, newly married, looking for a weekend getaway from the pressures of city life. They were excited about the property, full of plans for renovations and improvements. They lasted 2 months. I heard about their departure from the real estate agent, a woman named Carol, who had handled the sale. She called me because I was listed as a secondary contact on some of the property documents, and she wanted to know if I had any insight into what might have driven the new owners away. They had left suddenly, she said, abandoning most of their belongings in their haste to get off the mountain. They had refused to explain why, refused to even discuss the property, and had hired a moving company to retrieve their things rather than return themselves. I told Carol I didn't know anything. I told her the cabin was old, that old places sometimes made people uncomfortable. I told her that city folks often struggled with the isolation of mountain living. I lied, and I think she knew I was lying, but she didn't press. It was what she told me next that changed everything. When the cleaning crew went through the cabin to prepare it for resale, they found a box of photographs in the back of a closet. Polaroids, mostly, dozens of them, taken over the course of many years. The previous owners must have left them behind, Carol said. Probably forgot they were there. She had glanced through them, just to see if there was anything valuable or personal that needed to be returned. Every photograph showed the ridge, the trail behind the cabin, captured at different times of day and in different seasons, summer and winter, morning and evening, sunny days and overcast skies. Decades of images documenting the same stretch of mountain. And in every single photograph, somewhere in the background, barely visible among the trees, there was a figure in white. Carol's voice was shaking when she told me this. She had noticed it in the first few pictures and thought it was a coincidence, maybe a trick of the light or a piece of laundry left on a branch. But as she went through the box, photograph after photograph, she realized it was always there, always in the same pose, always facing the camera. A woman in white, standing motionless among the trees, watching whoever held the camera with a face that was never quite in focus. The photographs dated back to 1954. 2 years after my grandfather built the cabin, I asked Carol what she did with the photographs. She said she burned them, couldn't stand to have them in her office, couldn't stand the thought of anyone else seeing them. She burned them in her backyard fire pit and watched them curl and blacken until nothing was left but ash. I thanked her for calling. I hung up the phone, and then I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about all those summers I had spent on that mountain, all those hikes along the ridge trail, all those photographs my parents had taken of me playing in the woods, swimming in the creek, standing on the porch with my grandfather during the last summer before he died. I found our family albums that night, boxes of them stored in my mother's attic, documenting decades of vacations and holidays and ordinary moments. I started with the oldest ones, the black and white photographs from my grandparents' era, and worked my way forward through time. She was in all of them. Not obvious, not always easy to spot. Sometimes just a blur of white at the edge of the frame. Sometimes a shape among the trees that you might dismiss as a reflection or a shaft of light. But once you knew what to look for, once your eyes adjusted to the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. She was there in 1958, standing at the edge of the clearing while my grandmother hung laundry. She was there in 1967, visible through the window of the cabin while my father blew out birthday candles. She was there in 1985, a white smear in the background of my first steps on the cabin porch. She had been watching my family for generations, long before I was born, long before my father was born. Watching and waiting and standing on that ridge with her featureless face turned toward the cabin, patient beyond any human patience, present in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I burned the photographs, just like Carol had, watched them turn to ash in my sink while my hands shook and my heart pounded. But burning photographs doesn't burn memories, and it doesn't change what was captured in those images. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking at old family pictures, Christmas cards, wedding albums, random snapshots from vacations and gatherings. My eyes scan the backgrounds now, searching the edges of every frame, looking for a shape I hope I won't find. I haven't seen her yet. Not in these photos, not in this house, not in this life I've built far from those mountains. But I know she's still there, standing on that ridge at dusk, walking the trail with her impossible gait, stopping at the spot behind the cabin to watch with eyes she doesn't have. The cabin has been sold again, I heard. A family from out of state, looking for a summer place. I could warn them. I could tell them what I saw, what I found in those photographs, what has been watching from that ridge since before any of us were born. But what would I say? How would I explain? And would it even matter? Some things don't stop because you know they're there. Some things just keep watching, keep waiting, keep standing in the spaces between the trees with a patience that makes human lifetimes seem like heartbeats. She was there before my grandfather built that cabin. She'll be there long after the last of us is gone. I try not to think about what she's waiting for. I try not to think about what happens when she finally stops watching and starts walking toward the cabin instead of past it. I try, but I don't always succeed. And some nights, when the wind picks up and the trees outside my window sway in the darkness, I could swear I see a flash of white moving along the ridgeline. Just for a moment, just at the edge of my vision. Then it's gone, and I tell myself it was nothing. I tell myself that every night. I have made my living for 15 years documenting the places that America forgot. Abandoned factories in the industrial heartland, shuttered asylums with their records still scattered across the floors, mining towns that died when the seams ran dry and the companies moved on to richer ground. There is a particular kind of story that these places tell, a narrative written in rust and rot and the slow, patient work of nature, reclaiming what human hands once built. I thought I understood that story. I thought I had seen every variation of it that the Appalachian Mountains had to offer. Miller Creek taught me how little I actually knew. I found the town on an old geological survey map from 1938, one of dozens I had collected over the years from estate sales and library archives. The map showed a small settlement nestled in a hollow about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, marked with the symbols for a post office, a general store, and a schoolhouse. A notation in the margin indicated coal mining operations, though the handwriting was faded enough that I couldn't make out the company name. What caught my attention was a second notation, added later in different ink, abandoned 1943, no current population. Abandoned mining towns were nothing special. The mountains were full of them, settlements that had sprung up around a shaft or a seam and withered away when the coal ran out. But most of them had been picked clean decades ago, their buildings salvaged for lumber and their equipment sold for scrap. The ones that remained were usually documented, cataloged, occasionally turned into tourist attractions for heritage tourism. Miller Creek appeared in none of my databases. It wasn't mentioned in any of the regional histories I consulted. According to every source I could find, the town simply didn't exist. That made it irresistible. I drove out in late September, when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that crisp edge that makes the mountains feel ancient and alive. The route took me through a series of increasingly narrow roads, paved giving way to gravel, giving way to dirt, until I was navigating what amounted to a logging trail that hadn't seen maintenance since the Eisenhower administration. My truck handled it well enough, but I had to stop twice to clear fallen branches from the path. And by the time I reached the hollow where Miller Creek should have been, the afternoon was already sliding toward evening. The town was there, just as the map had promised, or what was left of it. Foundations of stone and crumbling concrete lined what had once been a main street, their outlines visible beneath decades of leaf litter and creeping vegetation. Chimney stacks rose from the undergrowth like broken teeth, some still intact and others collapsed into piles of brick that nature was slowly absorbing. Here and there I could make out the remains of larger structures, their walls reduced to suggestions, and their roofs long since surrendered to time and weather. It was a ghost town in the truest sense, a place where human presence had been erased so thoroughly that the forest was well on its way to forgetting it had ever been disturbed. The schoolhouse was the only building still standing. It sat at the end of the main street, larger than I had expected, its wooden frame somehow preserved while everything around it had crumbled. The roof had collapsed on one side and the windows were empty sockets, but the walls remained upright, defiant against the decades. A rusted bell still hung in the small tower above the entrance, and the front steps, though sagging, looked like they might still support weight. I had photographed dozens of abandoned schoolhouses over the years, and something about this one felt different. More present somehow, more aware. I set up my camera about 50 yards from the building, positioning it to catch the last golden light of sunset filtering through the trees. This was the shot I had come for, the image that would anchor my documentary, a symbol of lost childhood and forgotten communities, and the way time eventually swallows everything we build. I adjusted the focus, checked the exposure, and settled in to wait for that perfect moment when the light would turn the ruins into something beautiful. That was when I heard the singing. It started soft, so soft that at first I thought it was the wind moving through the empty window frames. A melody, high and thin, carried on air that was perfectly still. Children's voices, I realized, singing in unison, following a tune that I didn't recognize. The song had no words that I could make out, just sounds, syllables that might have been language and might have been something else entirely. It was coming from somewhere beyond the schoolhouse, somewhere in the ruins behind those collapsed walls. I called out. My voice sounded strange in that hollow, flat and small, absorbed by the forest before it could carry. The singing continued, unchanged, as if whoever was making it hadn't heard me or didn't care. I packed up my camera and walked toward the schoolhouse, following the sound, telling myself that there must be a logical explanation. Maybe a group of local kids had found this place, used it as a hangout. Maybe there was a camp nearby, some outdoor education program that I hadn't known about. People singing in an abandoned town wasn't impossible. It was just unlikely. The playground was behind the schoolhouse, in a clearing that the forest hadn't yet managed to reclaim. I stopped at the edge of it and felt something cold settle into my stomach, something that went beyond surprise or confusion into a territory I didn't have words for. The playground equipment was still there. Not rusted hulks, not collapsed frames, but intact structures that looked like they might have been installed last year. Swings hung from chains that showed no sign of weathering, their seats swaying gently in air that was perfectly still. A merry-go-round sat in the center of the clearing, its painted surface faded but unpeeled, turning slowly in a circle that no wind could explain. A set of monkey bars, a slide, a seesaw frozen at an angle, and footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed into the dust that covered everything. Small footprints, child-sized, circling the equipment in patterns that spoke of recent and repeated use. They overlapped each other, creating a palimpsest of movement that made my head hurt to look at. Running, walking, skipping, standing. Children had been here. Children had been here recently, playing on equipment that should have rusted to nothing decades ago. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It pressed against my ears, thick and heavy, and I could feel it on my skin like a physical weight. The swings stopped moving. The merry-go-round slowed and went still. The forest held its breath, and I stood there at the edge of that impossible playground, aware with sudden and terrible certainty that I was not alone. They were watching me. I couldn't see them, couldn't identify where they were hiding, but I could feel the weight of their attention like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Dozens of eyes, maybe more, fixed on me from the shadows of buildings that had no roofs, no walls, no places where anyone could possibly hide. The ruins around me were hollow, open to the sky, their interiors visible from where I stood. There was nowhere for anyone to be. And yet, they were there, watching, waiting, their presence as undeniable as the footprints in the dust. I backed away slowly. Some animal instinct, older than thought, told me not to run. Running would invite pursuit. Running would mean becoming prey. So I walked, one careful step at a time, keeping my eyes on the playground even as I retreated toward where I had left my equipment. The swings began to move again as I watched. Pendulum arcs that started small and grew larger, pushed by hands I couldn't see. The merry-go-round started to spin, slowly at first, then faster, its painted horses blurring into streaks of color. The singing started again, louder this time, closer. I don't remember the drive back. My next clear memory is of sitting in my truck on the paved road, miles from Miller Creek, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. The sun had set while I was driving, and the mountains around me were dark shapes against a darker sky. I sat there for a long time, waiting for my heartbeat to slow, waiting for the cold feeling in my stomach to fade. It was only later, back at my motel room, that I thought to check my footage. I had been recording when the singing started. The camera had been running the entire time, capturing everything I had seen and heard. Evidence, I thought. Proof that I hadn't imagined it, that something real had happened in that hollow. I connected the camera to my laptop and opened the files, ready to review the most important footage of my career. Static. Every frame was static, white noise and digital corruption, the kind of interference you see when equipment fails catastrophically. I scrubbed through the timeline, searching for any salvageable footage, any clear image I could extract. The static continued, frame after frame, minute after minute. And then I saw them. Beneath the static, visible only when I paused on certain frames and adjusted the brightness, there were shapes. Figures standing in rows in front of the schoolhouse, their outlines blurred but unmistakable. Children, dozens of them, arranged in neat lines like a class photograph. They were facing the camera, facing me, their mouths open in unison. They were singing. I could almost hear it, watching that corrupted footage. The melody from the hollow, that wordless tune that had drifted through the ruins like smoke, it was there in the static, encoded somehow in the interference, a song that my equipment had captured even as it failed to record anything else. I played the footage again, and each time I could hear it a little more clearly. Children singing. Children who had been dead for 76 years, standing in rows in front of a schoolhouse that should have collapsed decades ago. I deleted the footage that night, formatted the memory card, wiped the backups, erased every trace of what I had recorded in Miller Creek. I told myself it was because the footage was unusable, corrupted beyond recovery. I told myself it was because I couldn't build a documentary around static and shadows. But the truth is simpler and more shameful than that. I was afraid of what I might hear if I kept listening. I tried to research Miller Creek after I got home, spent weeks digging through archives and historical records, searching for any information about the town and what had happened there in 1943. I found almost nothing. A brief mention in a coal company's quarterly report, noting the closure of operations due to unspecified circumstances. A single line in a county census, showing a population of 237 in 1940 and 0 in 1945. No explanation, no details, no record of where those people went or what happened to them. There was one thing though, one document that I found in a file that should have been sealed, a coroner's report from a county office that had since been absorbed into a larger jurisdiction. The report was dated November 1943, and it concerned a fire at the Miller Creek schoolhouse. 34 children had died in the blaze, trapped inside when the doors somehow became blocked from the outside. The fire had been ruled accidental. No investigation had been conducted. The bodies had been buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of town. I think about those children often now. 34 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 14, gathered in a schoolhouse on a November morning in 1943. I think about the doors that wouldn't open, the windows too small to climb through, the smoke filling the room as they sang whatever song their teacher had chosen to calm them. I think about the parents who found them, the town that died with its children, the hollow that the forest has been slowly reclaiming ever since. I never went back to Miller Creek. I never finished my documentary. I sold my equipment and found a different line of work, something that keeps me in cities, surrounded by people, far from the places where the past refuses to stay buried. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that melody, drifting up from somewhere beneath consciousness, a song without words, carried by voices that should have been silenced 76 years ago. I hear it, and I remember those footprints in the dust, circling the playground equipment in patterns that suggested recent use. They're still there, still playing, still singing, still waiting for someone to open the doors and let them out. I grew up in these mountains. That's something people from the flatlands don't always understand when they hear stories like this one. They imagine us as visitors, as tourists who wandered into wilderness we didn't comprehend, who got themselves into trouble through ignorance or arrogance or simple bad luck. But I was born in Harlan County, raised on land my family had worked for 6 generations, and I learned to walk these trails before I learned to read. The forest was not foreign to me. It was home. And that's what makes what happened on Blackwater Trail so difficult to explain. Even now, even after all these years of trying to make sense of it, Blackwater Trail runs for about 7 miles through the Daniel Boone National Forest, starting at a small parking area off Route 421 and climbing through old-growth hardwood before dropping down to connect with the Sheltowee Trace near the county line. I had hiked it more times than I could count, in every season, in every kind of weather, at every hour of the day and night. I knew where the creek crossings got tricky after heavy rain. I knew which sections turned to mud in spring and which stayed passable year-round. I knew the landmarks by heart: the lightning split oak at mile 2, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear at mile 4, the abandoned moonshine still that the rangers pretended not to know about near the northern terminus. I knew that trail the way I knew my own hands, which is why, on the evening of October 14th, 2019, I couldn't understand how I had gotten so completely and utterly lost. The day had started normally enough. I'd taken a half day from work, wanting to get in one more good hike before the weather turned and the trails became less pleasant. October in eastern Kentucky is usually beautiful, the leaves changing color and the air carrying that crisp sweetness that makes you want to breathe deep and walk far. I parked at the trailhead around 3 in the afternoon, signed the register, and set off at a pace I could maintain for hours. Everything was fine for the first 2 miles. I passed the lightning split oak right on schedule and stopped to drink some water and check my phone. No signal, which was normal for this part of the forest. But the GPS was working well enough to confirm my position. I was exactly where I expected to be, moving at exactly the pace I expected to move. The sun was still high enough to cast long shadows through the canopy, and I estimated I had at least 3 hours of good light left before I'd need to think about heading back. I don't know exactly when things started to go wrong. There was no single moment I can point to, no clear transition from familiar territory to something else. The trail just changed, gradually at first, in ways I kept explaining away. A section I didn't quite remember, though I told myself I must have simply forgotten it. A stream crossing that seemed to be in the wrong place, though I convinced myself I had miscounted my landmarks. Small inconsistencies that accumulated like snow, each one individually dismissible, together forming something I couldn't ignore. The split came around what should have been mile 5. The trail forked, left and right, where no fork had ever existed before. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had walked this trail dozens of times. I had a topographic map in my pack that I had studied so often the creases were starting to tear. There was no fork at mile 5. There had never been a fork at mile 5. And yet here it was, 2 paths diverging into forest that looked identical in both directions, neither one bearing any resemblance to the trail I knew. I checked my GPS. The signal had died, the screen showing nothing but a gray void where my position should have been. I checked my compass, thinking I could at least orient myself by direction, and found that the needle was spinning lazily, unable to settle on any heading. I checked my phone and found it dead, the battery drained despite showing 80% charge when I'd started hiking. The sun was lower now, dropping toward the ridgeline with a speed that seemed wrong for early October. I had maybe an hour of light left, maybe less, and I was standing at a fork in a trail that shouldn't exist, with no working navigation and no clear sense of how I had gotten here. I chose the left path. I don't know why. There was nothing to distinguish it from the right, no logical reason to prefer one over the other. I just picked a direction and started walking, telling myself that all trails eventually led somewhere, that if I kept moving, I would find a road or a landmark or another hiker who could point me back to civilization. The light faded faster than it should have. Within 20 minutes, the forest had gone from golden to gray to something approaching full dark, the kind of darkness you only find in places far from any human habitation. I turned on my headlamp and kept walking, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the black, illuminating trees and undergrowth that looked nothing like the forest I knew. I called out for help around 8 o'clock. The darkness was complete by then, my headlamp the only source of light in a world that seemed to have swallowed the moon and stars. I was exhausted, disoriented, and scared in a way I hadn't been since childhood. I thought maybe there was another hiker out there, someone who had camped for the night, someone who might hear me and call back. Something answered. It came from somewhere ahead of me, maybe 50 yards into the darkness, beyond my headlamp's reach. My own voice, calling the same words I had just spoken, with the same inflection and the same cadence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Except it wasn't quite right. There was something off about the tone, something flat and empty, like a recording played back through damaged speakers. I froze, stood absolutely still, my breath caught in my throat, listening to the echo of my own voice fade into silence. I told myself it was just that, an echo, some trick of acoustics created by the terrain. Mountains did strange things to sound. I knew that. I had experienced it before, though never quite like this. I called out again. "Hello?" The answer came faster this time. "Hello?" My voice, from my throat, thrown back at me from a point that was closer than before. Not an echo. Echoes don't move, echoes don't get closer. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, moving through the underbrush, somewhere beyond the edge of my light. Not the quick scurrying of an animal, not the cautious tread of another hiker. Something else. Something that was walking toward me with a purpose I couldn't begin to understand. I stopped calling, stood there in the darkness with my headlamp cutting a pathetic circle of light into the void, listening to those footsteps approach. They stopped when I stopped, fell silent when I fell silent, as if whatever was making them was waiting for me to speak again. The mimicry continued anyway. "Hello?" My voice, from somewhere to my left. "Is anyone there?" My voice, from somewhere to my right. The words I had spoken minutes ago, played back to me from multiple directions, surrounding me in a chorus of myself. And beneath the words, threading through them like a dark current, those footsteps again, circling now, moving around me in a pattern I could track by sound alone, closing in from every direction at once. I ran. There was nothing else to do. Whatever rational thought I had left told me that running blind through unfamiliar forest in complete darkness was suicide, that I was more likely to break my neck on a route or walk off a cliff than escape whatever was out there. But the animal part of my brain had taken over, the part that remembered what it meant to be prey, and it didn't care about rationality or odds or anything except putting distance between me and those circling footsteps. I crashed through underbrush that tore at my clothes and skin. I stumbled over rocks and roots, catching myself again and again, my headlamp bouncing wildly and showing me nothing but strobing images of trees and shadows. Behind me, around me, the voices continued. My voice, calling my name now, a name I had never spoken out loud, repeated over and over from the darkness in tones that ranged from whisper to scream, and the footsteps, always the footsteps, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran, crashing through the forest on either side of me, hurting me, driving me, pushing me towards something I couldn't see. I don't know how long I ran. Time had stopped making sense somewhere in that darkness, stretched and compressed in ways that left me with no clear memory of duration. I only know that at some point, the trees thinned and the ground leveled out, and I found myself stumbling onto a trail I recognized. The main trail, Blackwater Trail, exactly where it should have been, marked with the same blazes and cairns I had followed 100 times before. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot. My truck was there, exactly where I had left it, sitting alone under a security light that bathed everything in harsh orange. I fumbled my keys out of my pocket and unlocked the door with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. That's when I saw the scratches. 5 parallel lines, carved into the driver's side door, running from the window down to the handle. Deep gouges in the metal, bright silver against the dark paint, too high to be any animal I knew of. I stared at them for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. 5 scratches, like fingers, like something had been trying to get in. I drove home with all the windows up and all the doors locked, checking my mirrors every few seconds for something following me. There was nothing there, just empty road and dark forest, and the memory of my own voice calling to me from the shadows. I reported myself lost to the ranger station the next morning, told them I had gotten turned around on Blackwater Trail, and spent a few hours finding my way back. I didn't mention the fork that shouldn't exist, the voices in the darkness, the footsteps that circled me like a predator sizing up its prey. I didn't mention the scratches on my truck. They would have thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe I still am. I tried to go back to Blackwater Trail once, about 6 months later, drove to the trailhead, parked my truck, walked to the register to sign in. I made it maybe 200 yards past the entrance before I heard it. Faint, distant, carried on a wind that wasn't blowing. My own voice, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I turned around and walked back to my truck and drove away. That was 4 years ago. I don't go into the woods after dark anymore. I don't go into the woods much at all, really. I tell people it's because I'm getting older, because my knees aren't what they used to be, because I've found other hobbies to occupy my time. But the truth is simpler and more shameful than that. I'm afraid of what might answer if I call out. I'm afraid of what might be waiting, patient and hungry, for me to get lost again. The scratches are still on my truck. I've thought about getting them fixed, about having the door repainted or replaced. But somehow I never do. They're a reminder, I think. A warning. Evidence that whatever happened that night was real, that something found me in the darkness and followed me back to my car, that it stood there in the parking lot and tried to get in while I was running blind through the forest. I wonder sometimes if it's still out there on Blackwater Trail, if it's still walking those woods, waiting for someone to call out, ready to answer back in a voice that isn't its own. I wonder if other hikers have heard it, have felt that terrible sensation of being surrounded by their own words reflected back at them from the darkness. I hope not. I hope I was the only one, that whatever I encountered that night has moved on or gone dormant or simply lost interest. But some nights, when the wind is right and the house is quiet, I could swear I hear something outside my window. A voice, faint and distant, calling a name that sounds almost like mine. I never answer. I never will. The novel had been killing me slowly for 3 years. What started as a passion project, something I believed in with the fervor of the newly converted, had become an albatross around my neck, dragging me deeper into frustration and self-doubt with every failed attempt at revision. My agent had stopped asking about it. My editor had moved on to other clients. Even my wife, patient and supportive as she was, had begun suggesting that maybe it was time to let it go, to start something new, to accept that not every book was meant to be finished. I couldn't do that. The story was inside me, fully formed, waiting to be excavated from whatever psychological sediment had buried it. I just needed time. Uninterrupted time, away from the distractions of daily life, away from the well-meaning suggestions and the pitying looks and the constant reminder that I was failing at the one thing I had always believed I was meant to do. I needed solitude. I needed silence. I needed to disappear into my own head until the words started flowing again. The cabin appeared on a rental site I hadn't used before, buried somewhere in the search results that I had been scrolling through for hours. The listing was sparse, almost deliberately vague. A one-bedroom cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, no neighbors within 5 miles, no cell service, no internet, available for long-term rental at a price that seemed almost suspiciously low. The photograph showed a simple structure, weathered but well-maintained, surrounded by forest that pressed close on all sides. The description mentioned that the property had been unoccupied for 6 months, awaiting a tenant who appreciated privacy. It was exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 2 weeks without hesitation. The drive took longer than expected, the GPS leading me through a maze of increasingly narrow roads until the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel gave way to dirt. By the time I found the cabin, the sun was already dropping toward the ridgeline, casting long shadows through the trees. The structure looked exactly like the photographs, a small wooden building with a covered porch and a stone chimney, sitting in a clearing that felt somehow smaller than it should have been. The forest loomed around it, dense and dark, and as I parked my car and stepped out, I was struck by the silence. Not quiet, silence. The complete absence of sound that you only encounter in places far from any human presence. The key was under a rock by the front door, just as the property manager had promised. I let myself in and stood for a moment in the main room, taking stock of my surroundings. A kitchenette along one wall, a small sitting area with a wood stove, a ladder leading up to a loft that served as the bedroom. Everything was clean and orderly, the kind of rustic simplicity that city people pay good money to experience for a weekend before retreating back to their central heating and grocery delivery. The dishes in the drying rack were still damp. I noticed it as I was unpacking my groceries, reaching for a shelf above the sink. 3 plates, 2 cups, a handful of utensils, arranged neatly on a plastic rack, beaded with water droplets that hadn't yet evaporated. I touched one of the plates and found it cool but wet, recently washed, recently handled. The listing had said 6 months unoccupied. The property manager had assured me no one had been to the cabin in weeks. I told myself the cleaning service had just left. Mountain time, mountain pace. Someone had come to prepare the cabin for my arrival and had finished only hours before I got there. It made sense. It was logical. I unpacked the rest of my groceries and tried not to think about it. The sheets smelled like lavender, fresh lavender, the kind you get from detergent or fabric softener, not the stale mustiness you would expect from bedding that had been sitting unused for half a year. I noticed it when I climbed up to the loft to drop off my bag, the scent hitting me as soon as I lifted the covers to check the mattress. The pillows were plumped. The blankets were arranged with hotel precision. Someone had made this bed recently, within the last day or two, and had used products that still carried their fragrance. The property manager, I told myself, preparing for my arrival, going above and beyond to make a good impression. I made a mental note to leave a positive review. The wood stove was warm. I didn't notice at first. I had started a fire almost immediately after arriving, wanting to take the chill off the cabin as the sun went down. It was only later, as I was adjusting the damper, that I realized the metal was already warm before I'd added any logs. Not hot, not actively burning, but warm in a way that suggested recent use. Someone had built a fire here not long ago. Someone had sat in this room and fed logs into this stove and watched the flames dance behind the glass door. 6 months unoccupied. That's what the listing said. That's what the property manager confirmed. I stood there with my hand on the warm metal, trying to reconcile what I was feeling with what I had been told, and I felt the first cold tendril of something that might have been unease. I convinced myself there was an explanation. There had to be. The cleaning service had used the stove to air out the cabin. The property manager had stopped by earlier and built a fire for atmosphere. Some reasonable, mundane cause that accounted for the damp dishes and the fresh sheets and the warmth radiating from iron that should have been cold. I poured myself a drink and sat down at the small desk I had designated as my writing station. I was here to work. I was here to finish my novel. I wasn't going to let a few minor inconsistencies derail me before I'd even started. The first night, I heard footsteps in the loft above me. I had fallen asleep on the couch, too tired from the drive to climb the ladder to the bedroom. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the main room, and I woke to the sound of movement overhead. Soft footsteps, careful and deliberate, crossing the wooden floor of the loft, back and forth, back and forth. The creak of floorboards under weight that shouldn't have been there. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding, listening to those footsteps trace patterns above my head. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I was supposed to be alone. But someone was up there, walking through the space where my bag still sat on the bed I hadn't slept in. I called out. My voice sounded strange in the darkness, thin and frightened. "Hello? Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for them to resume, waiting for someone to descend the ladder, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The cabin remained quiet, the embers faded to ash, and eventually I convinced myself I had dreamed the whole thing. Half asleep, disoriented from the drive, my imagination filling the silence with sounds that weren't really there. The second night, I found the handprint. I had spent the day writing, making more progress than I had in months, the words flowing with an ease I had almost forgotten was possible. The isolation was working. The silence was working. I could feel the novel taking shape again, emerging from whatever tomb I had buried it in, and by the time I stopped for dinner, I was feeling better than I had in years. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands and found the mirror fogged with condensation. Fresh condensation, droplets running down the glass, as if someone had just taken a hot shower, except I hadn't showered since I arrived. I had barely used the bathroom at all, preferring the outhouse during the day to conserve the cabin's limited water supply. In the center of the fogged glass, clearly visible, was a handprint, palm flat, fingers splayed, pressed into the condensation by someone who had stood exactly where I was standing and touched the mirror for reasons I couldn't imagine. The print was smaller than mine, narrower, the fingers long and delicate in a way that suggested someone's sleight of build. I wiped the mirror clean with my sleeve, told myself there was condensation from cooking, from the steam that rose when I boiled water for coffee. Told myself the handprint was old, left by the cleaning service or the property manager or some previous tenant whose presence had somehow persisted in the moisture on the glass. I didn't believe myself, but I stayed anyway, because the novel was flowing and the silence was perfect, and I had spent too much money and driven too far to leave after only 2 days. The third night, I woke to find my laptop open. I had left it closed on the desk, its screen dark, its documents saved and shut down before I climbed to the loft to sleep. But when I came down the ladder in the gray light of early morning, the laptop was open, its screen glowing with the pale blue of an active document. I walked toward it slowly, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, my heart beating in a rhythm that felt too fast, too loud in the silence of the cabin. The document was open to a blank page, the cursor blinking at the top, except it wasn't entirely blank. There was a single sentence typed in the center of the page, in a font I didn't recognize, in words I had not written. "You are in my home." I left that morning, packed my bags in a frenzy, threw everything into my car without caring about order or organization, drove away from that cabin as fast as the dirt road would allow. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, until I could see other cars and other people, and the evidence that civilization still existed beyond those watching trees. The property manager swore no one had been to the cabin in months. She seemed genuinely confused by my call, by my accusations, by my insistence that someone had been living in that space while I was there. She offered to send someone to check, offered a full refund, offered to report the incident to the police. I took all three. The police found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of habitation, no indication that anyone had been in the cabin except me. The loft was empty. The bathroom was dry. The laptop, which I had left behind in my haste to escape, was sitting closed on the desk exactly where it should have been. They suggested I might have been sleepwalking. They suggested I might have been stressed from work, from isolation, from whatever had driven me to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the first place. I almost believed them. I wanted to believe them. But then I checked my credit card statement. The charge appeared 3 days after I returned home, mixed in with the gas stations and fast food restaurants from my drive back. A purchase at a convenience store in a town I had never heard of, 20 miles from the cabin I had fled. The amount was small, just a few dollars, probably snacks or cigarettes or something else a person might need in the middle of the night. The timestamp was 3:17 a.m., the night I heard the footsteps. I was asleep on the couch when that purchase was made. My car was parked outside the cabin, my keys in my pocket, my credit card and my wallet beside the bed. Someone had taken my card while I slept. Someone had driven 20 miles in the darkness, bought something at a gas station, and returned before I woke. Someone had been that close to me, close enough to reach into my belongings, close enough to take what they wanted, close enough to do anything at all. I canceled the card, changed my locks, installed a security system at my apartment that beeps whenever a door opens. I never finished the novel. Could never bring myself to open that document again, to see if the words I had written were still there, or if they had been replaced with something else, something typed by hands I never saw. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the damp dishes and the fresh sheets and the warm wood stove, about the footsteps in the loft and the handprint on the mirror, and the sentence that appeared on my screen in the darkest hours of the night. "You are in my home." I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they're still there, waiting in that cabin for the next tenant to arrive, living in the spaces between presence and absence, watching from shadows that never quite reveal what they contain. I wonder if they followed me home. Some nights, when the apartment is quiet and the security system is armed, I wake to sounds I can't explain. Footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the soft click of a door that might be opening or might be closing, or might be nothing at all. I never check. I just lie there in the darkness, listening, waiting for the sounds to stop. They always do. Eventually, the trip was supposed to be a celebration. Michael had finally proposed to Sarah after 4 years of dating, and the four of us, me, my girlfriend Rachel, and the happy couple, had rented a cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee for a long weekend of hiking and drinking and toasting to their future. We had been friends since college, the kind of tight-knit group that survives graduations and relocations, and all the small drifts that pull people apart over time. This trip was meant to cement that bond, to mark a transition from one chapter of our lives to the next. I think about that often now, how something meant to celebrate beginnings became the start of an ending none of us could have anticipated. The cabin was perfect, a 3-bedroom place perched on a ridge with views of the Smoky Mountains stretching to the horizon. We arrived Friday afternoon and spent the evening on the deck, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and pink while we worked through 2 bottles of champagne. The conversation flowed easily, full of inside jokes and shared memories and speculation about wedding venues and honeymoon destinations. By the time we stumbled inside to sleep, I remember thinking that this was exactly what friendship was supposed to feel like. Saturday was for hiking. We chose a trail that the cabin's owner had recommended, a 6-mile loop through old-growth forest that promised waterfalls and scenic overlooks and the kind of natural beauty that makes you forget about everything waiting for you back in the real world. The hike was everything we'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, the trail was well maintained, and by late afternoon we were sitting on a rock outcropping, passing around a flask of whiskey and feeling like the luckiest people in the world. We stayed too long at that overlook, lost track of time watching the shadows lengthen across the valleys below. By the time we started back toward the trailhead, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains, and the forest was shifting from green to gray in the fading light. We picked up our pace, but the trail seemed longer on the way back, the landmarks less familiar, the darkness gathering faster than it should have. We reached the parking area just as full dark settled over the mountains. The car was where we'd left it, a silver SUV covered in a thin layer of pollen and fallen leaves. We piled in, exhausted but satisfied, ready for the hot showers and cold beers waiting for us back at the cabin. That's when the GPS started acting strange. The route it suggested didn't match the one we'd taken that morning. Instead of the paved county road that wound through the foothills, it was directing us towards something called Old Copper Mine Road, a route that didn't appear on any of the physical maps we'd brought. Michael was driving, and he hesitated at the intersection, squinting at the screen. "This doesn't look right," he said. Rachel checked her phone, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. Sarah pulled up her own GPS app and got the same result. Old Copper Mine Road. Estimated time to cabin 23 minutes, compared to the 45 it had taken us that morning. "Maybe it found a shortcut," Sarah said. "These apps update in real time." The sign at the turnoff was impossible to miss. Road closed. Danger. No trespassing. The letters were faded but legible, painted on a wooden barrier that had been pushed to the side of the road, leaving just enough space for a vehicle to pass. We should have turned around. We should have taken the longer route, the one we knew, the one that didn't require us to ignore multiple explicit warnings. But we were tired, and it was dark, and the promise of saving 20 minutes was too tempting to resist. Michael eased the SUV past the barrier and onto Old Copper Mine Road. The road was bad. Not impassable, but bad enough that Michael had to slow to a crawl, navigating around potholes and washouts in sections where the pavement had crumbled away entirely. The forest pressed close on both sides, branches scraping against the windows, headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through darkness that seemed to swallow the light before it could travel more than a few feet. The GPS kept recalculating, its cheerful voice announcing turns that led nowhere, distances that didn't match what we were seeing through the windshield. Nobody talked. The atmosphere in the car had shifted, the easy camaraderie of the afternoon replaced by something tenser, more watchful. I remember staring out the window at the trees sliding past, their trunks pale and ghostly in the reflected glow of the headlights, and feeling a growing certainty that we had made a terrible mistake. The road descended for what felt like hours, switchback after switchback carrying us deeper into a valley that our map said shouldn't exist. The temperature dropped as we went down, the windows fogging with condensation, and at some point, I noticed that the sounds of the forest had stopped. No insects, no night birds, just the growl of the engine and the crunch of tires on broken pavement and a silence that felt deliberate, watchful, alive. We reached the bottom of the mountain around 11 o'clock. The GPS announced that we had arrived at our destination, which was clearly wrong since we were still miles from the cabin, still deep in a forest that had no business being this dark, this quiet, this wrong. Michael pulled over to check the map, and Sarah turned around to grab a water bottle from the cooler in the back seat. She screamed. I have heard a lot of screams in my life. Movies, haunted houses, the occasional genuine fright from a friend jumping out from behind a door. None of them sounded like what came out of Sarah's mouth that night. It was a sound of pure, primal terror, the kind of scream that bypasses the conscious mind entirely and speaks directly to something ancient and animal buried deep in the human brain. I spun around in my seat and saw it. There was a figure sitting in the back seat, between Sarah and Michael's empty spot behind the wheel. Human-sized, human-shaped, but wrong in ways I couldn't process in the half-second before everything dissolved into chaos. The dome light was on, activated by the open cooler lid, and it should have illuminated everything in that cramped space. But the figure was shadow, pure shadow, darker than the darkness around it, its features hidden in a void that the light couldn't penetrate. We threw open the doors. All four of us, moving with a synchronicity born of shared terror, spilling out of the SUV and onto the cracked pavement of that impossible road. I remember running. I remember Rachel's hand in mine, her fingers crushing my knuckles as we put distance between ourselves and the car. I remember stopping maybe 50 feet away and turning back to look, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The SUV sat there, dome light still on, doors hanging open. The back seat was empty. We stood in the darkness for a long time, none of us willing to approach the car, none of us willing to speak about what we had seen. Eventually, Michael walked back to the driver's side door, his movements slow and deliberate, his face pale in the dim light. He looked in the back seat, checked the cargo area, got down on his knees and looked under the vehicle. "There's nothing here," he said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except exhaustion. "Whatever it was, it's gone." We drove the remaining 30 miles to the cabin in silence. I sat in the back seat, in the exact spot where the figure had been, because someone had to, and because I think I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The seat was cold, colder than it should have been, and there was a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and old, like wet leaves or turned earth. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody mentioned anything. The weekend ended early. We made excuses, invented obligations, packed our bags and drove home on Sunday morning instead of Monday afternoon. We promised to keep in touch, to schedule another trip soon, to not let what happened change our friendship. That was 8 months ago. I haven't seen any of them since. Sarah was the first to call. 3 weeks after the trip, late at night, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she was hearing things in her apartment, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, coming from corners where nothing should be, from closets she was afraid to open, from the space under her bed when she woke in the middle of the night. She said she had started sleeping with the lights on, that she had moved her furniture so nothing could fit in the shadows, that she was thinking about breaking her lease and moving somewhere else, somewhere with more windows, more light. I told her it was stress, told her the trip had shaken all of us, that our minds were processing trauma, that the sounds would stop once she gave herself permission to move on. I didn't tell her that I understood exactly what she was describing. I didn't tell her about the photographs. The first one appeared on my phone about a week after we got home, a picture of my bedroom, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer was standing at the foot of my bed. The image was dark, grainy, the kind of quality you get from a phone camera in low light. I was visible in the frame, a shape under the covers, clearly asleep. I deleted it and tried to convince myself it was a glitch. Phones do strange things sometimes. Cameras activate accidentally, capture images no one intended to take. But then there was another photograph the next night, and another, and another. They're always taken while I sleep, always from the foot of my bed, always at angles that would require someone to be standing in my room, watching me, raising my own phone to capture the image. And in every photograph, there is a shadow that shouldn't be there, a darkness at the edge of the frame, a shape that is almost human but not quite, standing in corners that should be empty. In every photograph, it is closer than the one before. Michael called me last month. He sounded worse than Sarah had, his voice hoarse and broken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He said his dog wouldn't go into the spare bedroom anymore. Said the animal would stand at the threshold and growl at nothing, hackles raised, teeth bared, refusing to cross no matter how much Michael coaxed or commanded. He said he had started keeping the door to that room closed, started avoiding that end of the hallway, started sleeping on the couch because his bedroom felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. I told him to see a therapist, told him we had all been traumatized, that healing takes time, that what we experienced on that road had left scars that wouldn't fade overnight. I didn't tell him about my photographs. I didn't tell him that I had started sleeping with my phone in a locked drawer, that the pictures appeared anyway, that whatever was taking them didn't need physical access to my device. Rachel won't talk to me anymore. She ended things a month after the trip, citing distance and compatibility and all the vague reasons people give when they don't want to explain the real cause. I saw her once, at a coffee shop downtown, and her eyes slid past me like I was invisible. Like looking at me might remind her of something she was trying very hard to forget. I check my phone every morning now, scroll through the camera roll, looking for images I didn't take, looking for the shadow that has been getting closer with each passing night. I know what I'll find eventually. I know that one morning I'll open that gallery and see a photograph taken from inches away, a face that isn't a face staring down at my sleeping form, a darkness that has finally closed the distance between watching and something else. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what we brought back from that mountain, what climbed into our car in the darkness of that impossible valley, what followed each of us home to places we thought were safe. I only know that it's patient, that it moves slowly, deliberately, closing in by degrees that are almost too subtle to notice. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, drive to that mountain, find that road, offer myself in exchange for whatever peace might come from confronting what we ran from. But I know it wouldn't matter. Whatever followed us down isn't on that mountain anymore. It's here, in our homes, in our lives, in the shadows that gather at the edges of our vision. And it's getting closer. Every night, in every photograph, it's a little bit closer than before. I wonder what happens when it finally arrives. My grandmother was not a fearful woman. She had raised 7 children on a farm with no running water and no electricity, had buried 3 of them before they reached adulthood, had outlived 2 husbands, and watched the world change in ways that would have broken someone with less iron in their spine. I never saw her flinch at a thunderstorm or startle at an unexpected sound. She handled snakes with her bare hands and slaughtered hogs without hesitation, and faced down the slow decline of her own body with a dignity that I still aspire to but have never achieved. The only thing I ever saw my grandmother afraid of was the well. It sat behind the farmhouse, about 50 yards from the back porch, in a clearing that had been worn to bare earth by generations of feet, walking the same path to draw water. The well itself was old, far older than the house, its stone walls sunk so deep into the ground that no one remembered who had dug it or when. A concrete cap covered the opening, thick and gray and heavy enough that it would have taken several strong men to move it. The cap had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and no one spoke about why. I asked my grandmother once, when I was maybe 8 or 9, what was in the well. We were sitting on the porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl, and I could see the cap from where I sat, that gray circle of concrete standing out against the green of the yard like a scar. She didn't answer for a long time, her fingers never pausing in their work, her eyes fixed on some middle distance I couldn't follow. "Bad things," she said finally. "Things we don't talk about. Things that happened a long time ago." I waited for more, but she just shook her head and changed the subject, asking me about school and friends, and whether I wanted to help her make biscuits for dinner. I learned early that there were topics my grandmother would not discuss, and the well was chief among them. She died the winter I turned 32, passing quietly in her sleep on a night when the first real snow of the season blanketed the mountains in white. The funeral was small, just family and a few neighbors who remembered when the hollow had been full of working farms instead of vacation homes and hunting cabins. I sat in the front pew of the little Baptist church where she had worshipped for 70 years and listened to the preacher talk about her faith and her strength and the legacy she left behind. The legacy, it turned out, included the farm. She had left it to me in her will, bypassing my mother and aunts and uncles in favor of the grandchild who had spent the most time there, who had loved the place with an intensity that the others never understood. The inheritance came with conditions, handwritten in my grandmother's cramped script on a separate piece of paper that the lawyer handed me along with the deed. Do not open the well. Do not remove the cap. Do not look into the darkness below. If you cannot honor these wishes, sell the property and never return. I kept the paper, read it a dozen times in the weeks after her death, trying to understand what she was warning me about. An old well on a remote property would be dangerous, I reasoned. Liability issues, structural concerns, the risk of a child or an animal falling in. My grandmother's caution made practical sense, even if her language seemed excessive. I moved into the farmhouse that spring, leaving behind a job and an apartment in the city that had never felt like home. The plan was to renovate the property, to update the plumbing and electrical and make it livable by modern standards while preserving its essential character. I hired contractors and ordered materials and threw myself into the work with an energy that surprised me, happy for the first time in years. The well watched me from the backyard. That's how it felt, anyway. Like there was something aware behind that concrete cap, something that noticed when I walked past and tracked my movements through the property. I tried to ignore it, tried to respect my grandmother's wishes, tried to focus on the house and the land and the future I was building for myself. But curiosity is a patient predator, and grief makes us do things we would never consider in happier times. I hired the contractor in June, a man named Davis who came recommended by one of the neighbors. I told him I wanted the cap removed, the well inspected, the whole thing evaluated for potential restoration or permanent filling. He didn't ask questions, just gave me a quote and a timeline, and showed up on the appointed day with a crew and a small crane to lift the concrete. The cap came off easier than I expected. Davis had estimated it would take most of the morning, but the crane had it lifted within an hour, swinging the heavy disc aside to reveal the opening beneath. The well was circular, lined with stones that had been fitted together without mortar, descending into a darkness that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The smell hit us immediately. It wasn't decay, wasn't stagnant water or mold or any of the things you might expect from a sealed well. It was cold. That's the only way I can describe it. The smell of cold itself, rising from the depths like breath from a frozen mouth, carrying with it something else I couldn't identify, something ancient, something wrong. Davis stepped back from the opening, his face gone pale beneath his tan. His crew followed suit, all of them retreating from the well as if pulled by invisible strings. I stood my ground, though something in my hindbrain was screaming at me to run, to replace the cap, to forget I had ever disturbed this place. "I need to measure the depth," Davis said, his voice unsteady. "Standard procedure. Drop a stone, count the seconds, calculate the fall." He picked up a rock from the pile of debris near the crane, a piece of limestone about the size of his fist, walked to the edge of the well, dropped it into the darkness. We waited, counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sound that came back was not a splash, not the crack of stone hitting stone. It was something else, something that might have been an echo, if echoes could carry emotion, if they could sound hungry and patient and aware. The sound rose from the depths and spread across the yard like ripples in water, and I saw Davis shudder as it passed through him. "I'm not lowering a camera down there," he said. "I'm not putting any of my equipment in that hole. Something's wrong with the sound. Something's wrong with the way it came back." I tried to argue, tried to convince him that wells were strange acoustically, that stone chambers did odd things to noise, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. And when Davis packed up his crew and drove away, I didn't try to stop him. I stood at the edge of the well for a long time after they left, staring down into that perfect darkness, that void that seemed to have no bottom, that opening in the earth that my grandmother had warned me about with her dying wishes. The cold smell rose around me, and I could feel it on my skin, seeping through my clothes, settling into my bones like frost. I should have replaced the cap immediately, should have called Davis back, paid whatever he asked, sealed the well forever, and built something over it to make sure I never looked into that darkness again. Instead, I went inside and made dinner and tried to pretend that everything was normal. The voice came that night. I was lying in bed, drifting somewhere between sleep and waking, when I heard it, distant at first, rising from somewhere outside the house, carried on air that was perfectly still. My name, spoken softly, in a tone that made my heart clench with recognition. It sounded like my grandmother, almost like my grandmother. The cadence was right, the accent, the particular way she would stretch certain syllables and clip others. But there was something underneath the familiarity, something that didn't belong. A coldness in the voice, a hunger, an emptiness that no living person could produce. I lay there in the darkness, listening to my name drift through the house like smoke. It was coming from the backyard, coming from the well. I did not go to the window, did not look out at the yard where that dark opening waited. I pulled the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters, and pressed my hands over my ears, and stayed that way until the sun rose and the voice finally faded. The contractor came back the next morning, looking sheepish and apologetic. He said he'd talked to his crew, that they'd agreed to help me reseal the well if I still wanted, that he felt bad about leaving the job unfinished. I hired him on the spot, doubling his fee, promising bonuses if they could finish by nightfall. They worked fast. The cap went back on by noon, and Davis spent the rest of the day reinforcing it with additional concrete, sealing the edges, making sure that nothing could move that barrier again. I had him add rebar and a second layer of cement, had him cover the whole thing with gravel and flagstones, had him build the foundation for a small garden shed directly over the site. When he left that evening, the well was buried under 400 pounds of concrete and stone and wood. There was no way to see it, no way to access it, no way for anything to get out. It didn't matter. The voice came again that night, and the next, and the next. It rises from beneath the shed, filtering through cracks in the foundation, seeping into the house like groundwater finding its level. My name, spoken in my grandmother's voice, calling me in tones that shift between pleading and demanding and something else I don't have words for. Some nights it sounds sad, like she's lost and confused, and needs my help finding her way home. Other nights it sounds angry, like I've done something unforgivable, like I've betrayed a trust I never knew existed. And some nights, the voice doesn't sound like my grandmother at all. Some nights it sounds like something else wearing her voice, using it the way a hunter uses a blind, mimicking familiar sounds to draw prey within reach. I have tried everything: earplugs, white noise machines, sleeping in town at the motel. Nothing blocks it out. The voice finds me wherever I go, as long as I'm within sight of that farmhouse, within reach of whatever waits beneath the earth. I understand now why my grandmother was afraid. I understand why she sealed the well, why she warned me to leave it alone, why she spent her whole life pretending that concrete cap was just another piece of the landscape. She knew. She had heard the voice too, had probably heard it for decades, had built her entire existence around avoiding its call. I should sell the property, should pack my things and leave and never look back, just like she suggested in her final wishes. But some nights, when the voice is soft and the loneliness is sharp, I find myself walking toward the shed, standing on the boards that cover the cap, listening to the sound of my name rising from somewhere far below. It knows things, whispers them through the wood and stone, secrets about my family, about the grandmother I loved, about what happened in this hollow before I was born. It promises to tell me everything if I just remove the cap, just look down into the darkness, just come a little closer. I haven't done it yet, haven't given in to the pull that gets stronger with each passing night. But I understand now that this is not a battle I can win through willpower alone. The voice is patient in ways that human patience cannot match. It has been calling from that well for longer than my grandmother was alive, longer than her grandmother, longer than anyone can remember. And sooner or later, everyone answers. I hear it now, as I write this, rising through the floorboards, drifting through the walls, filling the house with a sound that is almost my grandmother's voice. Almost, but not quite. The road that climbs from Harlan to the valley floor is not a forgiving stretch of highway. 17 miles of switchbacks and blind curves carved into the side of a mountain that seems to resent every vehicle that passes through its territory. Locals know to take it slow, to respect the grade and the weather, and the particular way the fog settles into the hollows on autumn mornings. Tourists and truckers learn the hard way, if they learn at all. Mile marker 7 is where they usually learn. I don't know what it is about that particular stretch that claims so many lives. The curve isn't the sharpest on the mountain. The grade isn't the steepest. The guardrail is reinforced, and the warning signs are clear, and the road surface is maintained better than most highways in the county. But something about mile marker 7 draws tragedy, the way a drain draws water, pulling cars off the edge, sending them tumbling down the mountainside into the trees below. The crosses started appearing when I was a child. Small wooden memorials driven into the soft earth at the shoulder, decorated with plastic flowers and laminated photographs and the names of people I sometimes knew. The county removes them periodically, citing safety concerns and right-of-way regulations, but new ones always appear within weeks. By the time I turned 30, there were enough crosses at mile marker 7 to fill a small cemetery. I had driven that road hundreds of times without incident, knew every curve, every pothole, every spot where the pavement buckled in the summer heat. I had passed mile marker 7 so often that it had become just another feature of the landscape, no more threatening than the gas station at mile 3 or the scenic overlook at mile 11. I told myself the accidents were caused by inattention, by speed, by the kind of reckless driving that tempts fate until fate decides to collect. I believed that until the night I stopped for the stranger. It was late October, the kind of night when the darkness comes early and the cold settles into the hollows like water pooling in low ground. I had been visiting my mother in Harlan, helping her clean out the attic of the house I had grown up in, sorting through decades of accumulated memories and deciding what to keep and what to let go. The work had taken longer than expected, and by the time I started the drive home, the sun had been down for hours, and the sky was thick with clouds that promised rain before morning. I was about 3 miles into the descent when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder of the road, right at the edge of where my headlights could reach, a dark shape against the darker forest behind him. His arm was extended, thumb out, the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. He was wearing a hooded jacket, the kind you might see on any young man hitchhiking through the mountains, and his face was hidden in shadow that seemed too deep for the angle of my lights. I should have kept driving. Everything in my body, every instinct refined by decades of mountain living, screamed at me to press the accelerator and leave that figure behind. People don't hitchhike on that road at night. The locals know better, and the tourists stick to the interstates where rides are easier to find. There was no reason for anyone to be standing on that shoulder in the darkness, thumb extended toward cars that rarely passed and almost never stopped. But the storm was coming. I could feel it in the pressure change, in the way the wind had picked up over the last few miles, in the distant flicker of lightning beyond the ridgeline. No one deserved to be caught on that road in the rain, exposed to the elements on a mountain where the temperature could drop 20 degrees in an hour. I thought about my own children, about how I would want someone to stop for them if they were stranded in the darkness. I pulled over. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires sounded impossibly loud in the silence that followed. I watched in my side mirror as the figure approached, moving with a gait that seemed wrong somehow, too smooth, too deliberate, like someone who had learned to walk by watching others, but had never quite mastered the rhythm. My hand hovered over the door lock, ready to engage it and drive away at the first sign of danger. The passenger door opened. He got in. The cold that entered with him was not the cold of the October night. It was something else, something deeper, a chill that seemed to radiate from his body, like heat from a stove, except inverted, pulling warmth from the air instead of adding to it. I could feel it on my skin, seeping through my clothes, settling into my bones with a weight that made it hard to breathe. "Thank you," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made my stomach turn. "The storm is coming. Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, trying to pretend that everything was normal when nothing about this felt normal at all. He didn't answer, just sat there in the passenger seat, his face still hidden beneath that hood, his hands folded in his lap. I pulled back onto the road and started driving, telling myself that the silence was fine, that not everyone wanted to make small talk, that I would drop him at the first gas station and never think about this again. The miles passed slowly. My headlights cut a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating curves and guardrails, and the occasional reflective sign warning of dangers ahead. The stranger didn't move, didn't shift his weight or adjust his posture, or do any of the small things that living bodies do without thinking. He sat perfectly still, like a mannequin, like something that had been placed in the seat rather than someone who had climbed in under their own power. We were approaching mile marker 7 when he spoke again. "David Michael Patterson," my full name. All 3 words, spoken clearly, precisely, in that soft voice that carried something cold and wrong beneath its surface. My middle name, which I hadn't used since childhood. My full name, which appeared on legal documents and nowhere else, which even my mother hadn't spoken aloud in decades. I turned to look at him, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands suddenly slick on the steering wheel. The hood had fallen back, or maybe it had never been there at all, and where his face should have been there was only shadow. Not darkness caused by lack of light, but shadow itself, a void in the shape of a human head, empty and deep and watching me with attention I could feel like pressure against my skin. I slammed on the brakes. The car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the road, tires screaming against the pavement, momentum throwing me against my seatbelt hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. I turned to the passenger seat, ready to throw open my door and run, ready to abandon the car and take my chances with the mountain and the storm. The seat was empty. I stared at the space where he had been sitting, where I had watched him climb in, where I had felt the cold radiating from his body for the last 5 miles. There was nothing there. No indentation in the upholstery, no lingering chill, no sign that anyone had occupied that space at all. The door was closed, the lock was engaged, the passenger seat was exactly as it had been when I started the drive, empty and untouched. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, headlights illuminating the guardrail at mile marker 7. I could see the crosses in my peripheral vision, the accumulated memorials of everyone who had died on this stretch of road, their plastic flowers rustling in the wind that was picking up as the storm approached. My name was still echoing in my ears, spoken in that voice that wasn't quite human, carrying knowledge that no stranger should possess. I drove the remaining miles in a daze. My hands moved the wheel, and my feet worked the pedals, but my mind was somewhere else, trying to process what had happened, trying to find an explanation that didn't require me to accept the impossible. Hallucination, I told myself. Exhaustion from the long day, stress from the memories stirred up in my mother's attic, the kind of waking dream that sometimes afflicts drivers on lonely roads at night. I almost believed it. When I got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time, unable to make myself get out of the car. The storm had arrived, rain drumming against the roof, lightning flickering in the distance, and I watched it through the windshield without really seeing it. My wife's car was in the garage, the lights in the house were on, and everything looked exactly as it should have. Normal, safe, real. I reached up to adjust my sun visor, a habit I'd developed over years of driving, and something fell into my lap. A photograph. Glossy and sharp, the kind of print you might get from a 1-hour photo lab, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen one of those. The image showed a stretch of highway at night, wet pavement gleaming in the glow of headlights, a guardrail running along the edge of the frame. Mile marker 7, captured from an angle that would have required the photographer to be standing in the middle of the road. And in the background, barely visible in the darkness beyond the reach of the light, a figure, human-shaped but wrong, standing at the edge of the forest, facing the camera. Where its face should have been, there was only shadow. Deep shadow, empty shadow, the same void I had seen in my passenger seat moments before someone spoke my name. I burned the photograph that night, held it over the flame of our gas stove and watched it curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. I told myself that destroying it would end whatever had begun on that road, that fire could purify what darkness had touched. I was wrong. I have driven that highway dozens of times since that night, and every time I approach mile marker 7, I see him. Standing at the shoulder, thumb extended, face hidden in shadow that no light can penetrate. Sometimes he's on the right side of the road, sometimes the left. Sometimes he's barely visible in my peripheral vision. Sometimes he's standing directly in my lane, forcing me to swerve around a figure that my rational mind insists cannot be there. I never stop anymore. I press the accelerator and hold my breath, and don't look at the passenger seat until I'm miles past that marker, but I can feel him watching as I pass, can feel the cold of his attention pressing against the windows, seeping through the seams, filling the car with a chill that no heater can dispel. The accidents at mile marker 7 continue, the crosses multiply, and I wonder, sometimes, how many of those drivers stopped for the stranger, how many of them heard their names spoken in that voice. How many of them found photographs tucked into places they shouldn't be, images of a road and a figure and a darkness that has no explanation. I wonder what happens to the ones who stop a second time. My wife asked me last week why I've started taking the long way home, the route that adds 40 minutes to my commute but avoids the mountain entirely. I told her it was construction, road work, temporary delays that would clear up eventually. I didn't tell her about the photograph I found in my desk drawer yesterday, a new one, sharper than the first, showing the same stretch of road from a different angle. Mile marker 7, the crosses visible in the foreground, the guardrail gleaming in light that might have been headlights or might have been something else. And in the center of the image, standing on the yellow line, that figure, closer now, clearer, the shadow where its face should be somehow deeper, somehow more present, somehow looking directly at the camera with attention that transcends the absence of eyes. I burned that photograph too. I know there will be another. I know that someday, the figure will be close enough to touch. And I know, with a certainty that keeps me awake at night, that when I finally see what's beneath that shadow, it will be the last thing I ever see. I should have known something was wrong when the realtor wouldn't meet me at the property. She insisted on showing me photographs and paperwork at her office in town, 15 miles from Thornwood Road, claiming that her schedule didn't allow for an in-person viewing. When I pressed, she offered to give me the lockbox code and let me tour the place myself. Real estate agents don't do that, not for a property they want to sell, not unless there's something about the property they don't want to be present for. I drove out there on a Thursday afternoon in early March, the sky heavy with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain or snow. Thornwood Road branched off from the county highway about 4 miles outside of town, winding through forest that grew denser with every passing mile. The pavement deteriorated as I drove, cracks giving way to potholes, giving way to stretches where the asphalt had simply crumbled away, leaving bare earth and gravel beneath. I passed 3 houses in the first mile, all of them occupied, all of them well-maintained. After that, nothing. Just trees and the narrowing road and the growing sense that I was driving into a place that didn't want visitors. The house appeared around a final bend, sitting in a clearing that felt too small for its footprint. It was a Victorian, 2 stories plus an attic, with the kind of ornate trim work that suggested someone had once cared deeply about its appearance. That care was a distant memory now. The paint had long since surrendered to the elements, leaving behind gray wood that looked almost fossilized. The porch sagged at one corner, pulling the front door out of true. The windows were dark and empty, some of them cracked, others clouded with decades of grime. And the yard. God, the yard. The weeds grew waist-high in places, brown and dead from the winter, but thick enough that I could tell they would return with a vengeance once spring arrived. They pressed against the house like supplicants, climbing the porch steps, reaching toward the windows, covering what had once been a walkway and a garden and probably a lawn. The property felt less abandoned than consumed, as if nature was slowly digesting something it had swallowed a long time ago. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, trying to understand why the price was so low. The house needed work, certainly, but the bones were good. The lot was nearly 2 acres. In any other market, someone would have snapped this up years ago, renovated it, flipped it for a profit. But according to the realtor, the property had been on and off the market since the late 60s, 50 years without a buyer. 50 years of sitting empty at the end of a road that seemed to grow longer every time I looked back the way I had come. I bought it anyway. The price was too good. The potential was too clear. I was going through a divorce and needed a project, something to occupy my hands and my mind while my life fell apart around me. The house on Thornwood Road seemed like exactly what I needed. I moved in on a Saturday in late April. The weeds had returned, just as I'd predicted, greener and thicker than before. I spent the first day clearing a path from my truck to the front door, hacking through vegetation that seemed to resist the machete with something approaching stubbornness. By the time I got inside, the sun was setting, and I was too exhausted to do anything except unroll my sleeping bag in the main parlor and collapse. The sounds started that first night. I woke around 3 in the morning to movement in the walls. Not the scratching of mice or the scurrying of squirrels, but something larger, something deliberate. I lay there in the darkness, listening to it travel from one end of the house to the other, mapping the interior with a thoroughness that made my skin crawl. It moved through the walls like someone walking through a corridor, pausing at certain points, lingering in others, following a route that suggested familiarity with the structure. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon that had taken up residence in the crawl space, maybe, or a possum that had found a way into the spaces between the plaster and the exterior siding. Old houses were full of gaps and openings. Wildlife moved through them all the time. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing that couldn't be explained by the simple fact that I had purchased a building that had been empty for decades. I set traps the next morning, humane ones at first, then progressively less humane as the days passed, and nothing triggered them. I spread poison in the crawl space in the attic. I sealed every gap I could find in the exterior walls. I hired an exterminator who spent 4 hours searching the house and found nothing. No droppings, no tracks, no sign that any living creature had been in those walls. The sounds continued. Every night, around 3 in the morning, that deliberate movement through the bones of the house. I started staying awake, waiting for it, tracking its progress through the walls as it mapped the interior over and over again. Sometimes it would pause directly behind where I was sitting. I could feel it there, separated from me by a few inches of plaster and wood, listening as intently as I was listening. I found the first drawing about 3 weeks after I moved in. I was cleaning out a closet in one of the upstairs bedrooms, pulling down shelves that had warped with moisture and age. When I removed a shelf near the back, I found something on the wall behind it. A drawing, done in charcoal directly on the plaster, crude but unmistakable. It showed the house from the outside, viewed from approximately where my truck was usually parked. The perspective was slightly off, the proportions distorted in ways that made the building look larger than it was, more looming, more present. But it was clearly this house, rendered by someone who had stood in that spot and sketched what they saw. I told myself it was old. A child's drawing, maybe, from one of the families who had lived here decades ago. Kids drew on walls. It was annoying but harmless. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that should have made my hands shake the way they were shaking as I stared at those charcoal lines. Then I found the second drawing. This one was behind a piece of furniture in the parlor, a heavy bureau that I had moved to refinish the floors beneath it. The drawing showed a figure lying on the floor, surrounded by darkness, features rendered in rough strokes that suggested sleep or unconsciousness. The figure was in the exact position I had been in that first night, when I had unrolled my sleeping bag in the parlor and collapsed from exhaustion. The drawing was of me. I searched the house after that, methodically, room by room, moving every piece of furniture, opening every closet, checking every wall and floor and ceiling for more drawings. I found 17 of them in total. Some showed the house from various angles, exterior views that could only have been made by someone walking the perimeter. Others showed the interior, rooms rendered in charcoal with furniture in positions I recognized. And 3 of them, the 3 that finally drove me out of the house, showed me. Me sleeping in the parlor, me cooking dinner in the kitchen, me sitting on the porch at sunset, visible through a window, sketched by someone who had been inside the house while I was outside. The last drawing was the worst. It showed a face, or rather, it showed many faces, crowded together, overlapping, watching from a window that I recognized as the one in the upstairs hallway. Faces I did not know, features I had never seen, rendered in charcoal with a skill that far exceeded the crude quality of the other drawings. They were watching, all of them, dozens of them, pressed against the glass of a window that looked out onto the front yard. Watching me. I left that night, packed what I could carry, drove to a motel in town, and didn't go back for 3 days. When I finally returned, in broad daylight, with a friend who had agreed to help me collect the rest of my belongings, the drawings were gone. Every single one of them. The walls where they had been were clean, the charcoal erased or absorbed, or simply vanished. My friend thought I was losing my mind. I couldn't blame him. I was starting to wonder the same thing myself. I tried to sell the house, called the realtor who had sold it to me, and told her I wanted to list it immediately, at a loss if necessary. She was sympathetic but not surprised. She said she would put it back on the market, but warned me not to expect offers. The house had a reputation, she said. Everyone in town knew about it. No one would touch it. I asked her what had happened there, what had made the house so toxic that it could sit empty for half a century without a buyer. She was quiet for a long time before answering. People disappear, she said finally. Not often, not all at once. But every family that's lived there, going back to the original owners, has lost someone, a child who wandered off and was never found. A husband who went to check on a strange noise and didn't come back. A grandmother who was there one moment and gone the next. The house takes people. That's what the old-timers say. It takes them into the walls. I tried to demolish it, hired a crew from out of town, contractors who didn't know the history, who were just happy to have the work. They showed up on a Monday morning with heavy equipment and permits and a timeline of 2 weeks. By Wednesday, they were gone. The foreman called me from his truck, already driving away, and told me his crew refused to go back. He wouldn't explain why, just said that some jobs weren't worth finishing. So the house sits there, at the end of Thornwood Road, waiting. I still own it. I still pay the taxes on it. Still receive the occasional inquiry from the realtor. Still drive past it sometimes on my way to somewhere else. That's when I see the light. It's not always there. Some nights the house is dark, exactly as it should be, its windows empty, its porch swallowed by shadows. But other nights, maybe 1 in 10, I see a flickering glow in the upstairs window. A candle, I think, or something that wants to look like a candle. It wavers and dances and casts shadows against the glass, shadows that move in ways the flame alone could not account for. And behind the light, silhouetted against its glow, a shape. Human-sized but wrong. Proportions distorted the same way the house is distorted in those charcoal drawings. It stands at the window and watches the road, watches my car as I drive past, watches me with attention I can feel even through the glass and the darkness and the distance. I have stopped checking on the house, stopped driving down Thornwood Road unless I absolutely have to, stopped thinking about the drawings and the sounds in the walls and the faces pressed against the window glass. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about those people who disappeared, the children and husbands and grandmothers who were there one moment and gone the next. I wonder if they're still in the house somewhere, in the spaces between the walls, in the darkness that the drawings tried to capture. I wonder if they're the ones making the sounds I heard, moving through the bones of the building, mapping an interior they can never escape. And I wonder if the shape in the window is watching for me, waiting for me to come back, patient in ways that only something that has been waiting for 50 years can be patient. The house at the end of Thornwood Road is still there. The light still flickers in the window. And some nights, when the darkness is absolute and the silence is complete, I could swear I hear something moving in the walls of my apartment, traveling from one end to the other, mapping the interior, learning the layout of a new home.